background to this study. You know, some of you may recall, I actually presented on this at the interim stage a year ago at our Shenzhen conference. Now this is quite literally, the finished report. And I think the findings are quite surprising. The backdrop to the study, of course, is that, as we know, there are more than 1 million people moving into cities every week. So really the question becomes, where do these people go? Do they go in denser, more vertical cities, or do they go in expanding horizontal cities? And we think we know the answer. I think most people in this room and at this conference think they know the answer, and I think we all intrinsically believe that density and verticality is a good thing. And I also believe that. But the story, you know, it's far more nuanced, really. And so we a few years ago, we looked at this, and we couldn't find a study that actually proved it. There were some very large-scale studies, you know, out there, like total energy consumption of Chicago divided by total population of Chicago compared with other cities, but not real detailed studies of what the sustainability implications of living in high-rise as opposed to living in suburbia was. So that was our starting point. We thought we were going to change this. So we took 4 high-rise towers in Chicago, and we ran an extensive campaign to get the engagement of the households to give us data, to give us their energy bills for 12 months, water bills, gas, electricity, to track their transport movements, to tell us about their quality of life, all these things. And then we took the equivalent, and we got about 270 households to buy into this. So it's not a massive study. We're not talking millions of people, but it's not a small study. It's not, you know, just the people in this room. We got about 270 households to engage, and then we got the engagement of an equivalent number of households in an area of Chicago called Oak Park, where actually I happen to live. And that was part of the reason we took Oak Park, because I could coerce all my neighbors to give us the data, because it was a pretty big ask, yeah? And so we did this study, and so really the point I want to emphasize is that it's based on real data, real bills, real people, and as I said, the findings are a little surprising. I bet you've seen this graph this week already. This is a seminal study done by Newman and Kenworthy, which looks at that relationship between energy consumption and density. Predominantly in transport energy consumption, but the problem with this study, which is still widely cited around the world, it was done in 1989. I mean, that was like a different era in terms of sustainability. Okay, the thing I want to stress with this is it's a pilot study, and it'll quickly become apparent why I am saying we need to treat it with some caution, because it's very particular, not only to Chicago, but the particular case studies that we looked at in Chicago. Here are the factors. Here are the factors that the study embraced. So you can see water consumption, energy consumption, mobility and transport, infrastructure, which is really interesting, and quality of life. Today, I'm just going to focus on 3 of those. So we're only going to talk about energy, mobility, and infrastructure. If you want to hear about the other bits or more detail of what I'm going to present, then you can go and buy the report. So this is the setting. 4 high-rise towers within the downtown area, and Oak Park, which is 7 miles from the center of Chicago. Now, let me just stress to you that the suburbs of Chicago go another 2 hours beyond Oak Park. And that was important, because this wasn't a loaded study where we set out to prove that high-rise buildings were better than suburbia. We could have taken a suburb like Naperville, 2-hour commute outside, and it would have showed different results. We chose this partly because I lived there, but partly because we felt it was more akin to a European or an Asian scenario where there is mass transit, and most people travel downtown for work via mass transit. So here are the case studies. 4 high-rise buildings, 2 of which have been built in the last 10 years, and 2 are 1950s Mies van der Rohe towers. So even within the high-rise, there was quite a variation. But in Oak Park, predominantly single-family, two-story homes. As I said, the main data, we had an online portal through which all this data was collected, and I'm just emphasizing there that it was based on real data and real energy bills. In the high-rise case, that included the commitment of the building owners, not just the condo owners. So the energy took into account all the common areas, not just the units. And some of those are recognized here, including the Village of Oak Park. You know, they were very supportive. The schools district, you know, we put flyers in the schools, in the kids' backpacks. We really got a great engagement. You can see that 48% of people in the low rise and 25% in the high rise actually ended up engaging in this study. Not to begin with, you know, we had to push them, push, but eventually we got a great engagement. Okay, I'm just going to jump to the results now. I could talk to you for hours and hours about each section, but I'm just going to jump to the results. Here's the first shocking result. The high-rise buildings consumed 5% more energy on a square foot basis than the suburban homes. And I'll tell you why that's even more shocking. Because my house in Oak Park was built in 1888 and has no insulation in the walls. That's pretty shocking, yeah? Two of these towers have been completed in the last 10 years, and yet the suburban homes consume 5% more energy, even with that massive surface area for heat loss and heat gain, consumed more energy. I'm going to get onto the reasons for this towards the end. And it may not be replicable across other case studies in Chicago and other places, but, and certainly demographics came into this in a massive way. But the other thing that people spoke about, which I think impacted this in the high-rise buildings, was a lack of control. A lack of control. And I think it's really important for our industry. In your own home, if it's hot or cold, you respond to that because you have direct control over your environment. Not so much in the high-rise buildings. People spoke about it being hot, the heating still coming through, and the only option was to open windows to try and dissipate some of that heat. Those kind of scenarios. The other thing that factored in this and needs to be recognized is there's a hell of a lot of facilities in the high-rise building. Swimming pools, libraries, activity rooms. And to be fair, we didn't factor those into the suburban. You know, because in the suburban, they're in separate buildings. So if we were being fair, we would have also calculated the energy consumptions of the nearby swimming pool in the suburban setting. So again, I'm just laying this out for you so you can see what the limitations were. Okay, embodied energy. So we set out, so that's operating energy. Embodied energy, we set out to calculate the energy required to build the buildings. We quickly realized it was impossible to calculate that, partly because we were dealing with something like, 300 buildings altogether, but partly because there's no methodology and no data to do it. So we did a desktop study, which again was pretty shocking. I think around the entire world, we found 27 published case studies that give some indication of the embodied energy of low-rise buildings, and ranging, from massive range in the figures per square of gigajoules per square meter. But what we did is we took all these studies, we analyzed them, and we averaged, and it came out at 6.8 gigajoules per square meter embodied energy for the low-rise setting. The high-rise was even worse. There were only 16 studies, and 15 of them were office buildings, so nobody cares about residential embodied energy. But the results of that were that it was 10 point something, I should have worn my glasses, 10 point something gigajoules. But here's the headline. Basically, the high-rise building required a third as much again, almost half as much again, to build the building than the low-rise. There's no surprise there. There's no surprise there, The tall building has many more things in it than the low-rise building, and has to perform in an environmental condition at height far greater than a low-rise building. Maybe the surprise is that it wasn't greater than 50%. Okay, this was surprising. Mobility. Really, really surprising. And by the way, we studied everything. Every single destination that you would go to typically, schools, work, shopping, friends and family, restaurants, every mode that you could get there by, virtually every mode, automobile, metro, elevated train, walking, bicycling. There was even the nuance to allow you to say, well, on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I travel by car to work. On a Tuesday and Thursday, I walk and then get the train or whatever. So this was really quite a detailed study. So the first finding, on a per household basis, the suburban homes were traveling approximately twice as far as the high-rise homes on a per household basis. But on a per person basis, they were traveling about the same distance in a year. Now just think about that for a second, because the whole kind of belief in the industry, well, not in industry, but in life generally, that if you live downtown, you travel less distance. You're not commuting as far by train. You're not commuting, as far for work and all these things. Not necessarily the case, we found. In terms of time, the suburban household spent 56% more time traveling on a household, but traveled 10% less time on a per-person basis. Someone living in suburbia spent 10% less time traveling per year than someone downtown. That's pretty shocking, yeah? Now, we can only put this down to the fact that the people downtown went out walking around the city and doing stuff, because there was more reason to travel as opposed to suburbia. Yeah, but it was surprising. You can see, this is not so surprising, 60% of travel in the low-rise was to work. That was only 37% in the high-rise. But here's the most shocking statistic. Those people living in high-rise buildings traveled 9% greater distance per automobile in a given year than the suburban residents. Just think about that. Don't you move into the city to give up your car and travel everywhere on foot and by public transit? You do, don't you? How can they be traveling 9% greater distance by car? Look at the home ownership. In the high-rise, car ownership. The car ownership was higher in the high-rise buildings than in the low-rise buildings. I'm going to tell you why this is at the end. It comes back to demographics, but again, it reinforces the initial point. This is nuanced. It's not as simple as just saying density is done. Density is great, job done. Infrastructure. Impossible to calculate infrastructure. So here's what we did. We recognized that most infrastructure follows the road systems. So we very simply, and it wasn't simple, we calculated the entire area of road, not only in the suburban and downtown areas, but in all the connecting areas. We literally measured the area of road and the linearity, the linear distance of roads throughout the city. We considered the city as a hypothetical finite model, right? So, and what we said is those people who live downtown, which is on the right, they stay downtown. They live there, they work there, they eat there, they play there. Those people in Oak Park, they live in Oak Park, but the majority of them travel downtown for business. Simplified, but generally true. So therefore, the infrastructure in Oak Park is only used by the people who live in Oak Park. The infrastructure in downtown is used by the people who live downtown, Oak Park, and all those connecting areas. And what we did is we turned it into an equivalent residential population by considering the working day. So that daytime population change, we said, well, there's 8 working hours, so that's 8/24 of that daytime population gain, 5 days a week, so 5/7 of that population. So you can see what this did. The actual population of these two areas, oh, by the way, geographically in area exactly the same size. So surface area, Oak Park and the downtown area, exactly the same size. Resident population is about just over 2.5 times greater downtown than Oak Park, but when you factor in the population change, then it's basically that 119,000 is going up to 250,000, close to 250,000 equivalent people, which are factored into using that infrastructure. So this is what we found. This is what we found, and this is one of the main findings of the study. The suburban existence required 833% of the infrastructure to support its existence on a per-person basis. And in the context of this conference, I think that's the key finding. You know, it's not necessarily about just the tall building. It's that concentration of land use and infrastructure in the city that is the real benefit. Okay, so just I've picked out 4 things here that were in favor of the high-rise and 4 that were in favor of the low-rise. So in the low-rise scenario, 5% less energy than the high-rise. In the embodied energy, 2/3 of the amount of energy required to build a high-rise. Total travel time, less time spent traveling, actually, in the low-rise scenario, and amazingly, but less time traveling by automobile. In the high-rise, we didn't go into this, but less water usage, 3/4 of the water usage, which again, no gardens, no yards, you'd expect it to be less water usage in the high-rise. 274% of the distance per person spent walking and cycling. So that's what we'd expect in the high-rise scenario. Or maybe you wouldn't. Doesn't everyone cycle out in the suburbs? Not in this study. 50% of the suburban distance, 49% traveling by public transit. And then, as I said, the infrastructure network favored the downtown. Okay, now let me tell you how my study was fundamentally flawed. Okay, and this is why we need to take it with a pinch of salt. We set out to compare apples to apples, and let me tell you that in high-rise residential buildings in Chicago, there's no apples. We ended up comparing pretty rich families living in Oak Park with very rich, mostly retired empty nesters in the high-rise buildings in Chicago. And that did skew our findings, but not to the point where we can just rule all this out, because isn't that a commentary in itself? You know, that we're building these towers and saying, well, we're increasing density, we're increasing population, we're increasing. In Chicago, at least, and in many other cities around the world, we're building these residential towers for one socioeconomic group, and often one social group. It's kind of students or rich people, retired people, older people, and the families are not being accommodated. I know this is different in other parts of the world, but just look at that. The average age in the high-rise buildings of our study was 20 years greater than in the low-rise. 20% of the actual residents were retired, as opposed to 6% in Oak Park. 40% of the suburban people were students. That means from age 0 up to 21, it included university students. Average household income in the US is $75,000 per year, household. In Oak Park, it was 3 times that, 175, getting 2.5 times. In the high-rise buildings, 220,000 average. So this skewed our findings. If you look at how it directly impacted the space, so there was an average of 1.9 people living in the high-rise as opposed to 3.4. And so a lot of the stuff that I've shown you today is on a per-person basis. And you know, if you think about it, that transport data, for example, a trip to the shops in the high-rise setting might just be, you know, whatever, 60-year-old male walks to the shop, gets the shops and and comes back again. In the suburban setting, it might be mum or dad getting in a car with 3 kids out of necessity to drive, you know, and then so it's divided by 4. So I'm being open with you that, but having said that, how else can you calculate, you know, the usage of infrastructure and travel and all these things. So you can see that actually the gross floor area per person in our high-rise case studies, there was more space, but these people had more space in their home per person than the suburban setting. Okay, so what do we do next? Well, we're hoping to build on this with a phase 2 study. It's only a small thing that's needed to enable that study, and that's a hell of a lot of funding for anyone in the audience who has a hell of a lot of funding. We want to do it again, and this time we want to be taking buildings of differing heights, not just, by the way, 2 of these towers were 80 stories. Those are not necessarily indicative of a standard high-rise residential building, yeah? So we want to take buildings of different heights, in different urban and suburban locations. We want to be embracing more diverse socioeconomic groups, because there are families in tall buildings in Chicago, like there are in every city, but it's not the headline tall buildings that we all know and that were embraced in this study. So social housing, and possibly across cities, if we can. Same study across a number of cities. So all we need is the funding. If interested, please contact me or my colleague back in Chicago. And if you're interested in this, then I think the report's like $30 or something, $32. And just the methodology that we laid out on how to calculate this is worth having a look at in more detail. Okay, thank you.